Today's passage is Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 8. Let's read together. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph, is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Amen." The emotional tension between Joseph and his brothers reached its climax. Finally, Joseph could no longer control his emotions in front of them. The book of Genesis describes the progression of Joseph's feelings in great detail. The first instance appears in chapter 42. When Joseph met his brothers for the first time, he was testing them as spies and secretly overheard their conversation, which caused him to weep. Then during their second meeting, he was so deeply moved by the sight of his brother Benjamin that he had to leave their presence to weep. Until this point, Joseph had managed to control his emotions in front of his brothers. But the third time was different. Though Joseph had steeled himself once more, he heard Judah's plea and could no longer restrain his suppressed feelings. Verse 1 says this, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence!' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. Joseph finally broke down and wept before his brothers. Verse 2 records, "And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it." We can see that Joseph was so overcome that he could no longer control the emotions he had been suppressing. Joseph is weeping. What is the meaning of his tears? Why is he wailing before his brothers? Perhaps his tears contained a longing for his father and a deep sorrow. And perhaps it was the desperate expressions on his brothers' faces, especially Judah's sincere, devoted love for Benjamin and his concern for their father's well-being, that finally broke down Joseph's ironclad emotional wall. After being appointed prime minister, Joseph had managed the affairs of all Egypt with a cool head, wielding Pharaoh's authority. But now, such a man could no longer remain composed. He first dismissed all the Egyptians from his presence. He did not want to show them what he considered a moment of weakness, unbecoming of the prime minister of Egypt. Nor did he want outsiders to witness the moment when the conflict and wounds that had separated the brothers for over 2 decades were finally being healed. And so, in private, Joseph wept uncontrollably before his brothers for a long time. The image of Joseph sobbing before his brothers was not that of the prime minister who commanded the most powerful nation on earth, but that of the tender-hearted 17-year-old Hebrew boy he once was. After weeping for some time, Joseph finally revealed his identity. Verse 3 says, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." There is something we should consider here. Joseph had controlled his emotions several times before, but this time he could not hold back and revealed his identity while weeping. Seeing this, we might wonder, couldn't Joseph have just greeted his brothers warmly and revealed his identity the very first time he saw them? Was there a reason he had to hide his identity, even while suppressing his own feelings? Why did Joseph suppress his emotions for so long? We are not Joseph. From our perspective, it might seem better if Joseph had revealed himself a little earlier and welcomed his brothers more warmly, but it was not so from Joseph's perspective. For him, revealing his identity meant dredging up the deep wounds of the past. This is by no means an easy task. The pain of being abandoned by his brothers was a memory and a hurt he did not want to confront ever again. Therefore, we cannot easily say, why isn't Joseph revealing himself? Why does he keep testing his brothers and making them uncomfortable? From Joseph's perspective, it took great courage not to deny or ignore the emotions welling up inside him, but to finally react honestly. He had to summon his courage. There is a saying that pain is the seed of growth. Like Joseph, we experience various forms of pain in our lives, and naturally we want to avoid it. It is human nature to be reluctant to recall and confront the pain of the past. However, this memory of pain and these wounds are not something we should simply avoid, but something we must confront. When we confront our pain, we can grow, become stronger, and gain the strength to see the world from a new perspective. The wounds of the past are not problems that are resolved simply by the passage of time. They require a process of understanding and accepting the suffering. Through the effort of accepting the pain and seeking to find meaning in it, we become deeper people. Through this, we can move toward true recovery and healing. Joseph is going through that very process. From his perspective, the easiest choice would have been to bury the past, pretend not to know his brothers, and simply live on as the Prime Minister of Egypt. The moment he revealed himself, he would not only have to face his own wounds, but also take responsibility for his entire family. It would be a heavy burden. Yet Joseph confronts it. By confronting his own pain, he is moving toward true recovery and healing. As Joseph reveals his identity, he begins to speak to his brothers more warmly. Until now, Joseph had referred to Jacob as your father. But in verse 3 he now says, my father. He asks, is my father still living? Joseph is beginning to open his heart to his brothers. Then, Joseph brings up something that would be deeply uncomfortable for his brothers. At the end of verse 4, Joseph introduces himself like this, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Joseph, having confronted his own pain, now brings up his brother's painful secret. The one story that only the brothers knew, that they had sold him into Egypt, is now brought into the light. Selling a person for money is human trafficking. Such a crime was a serious offense, often punishable by death, even in ancient societies. Joseph is exposing the secret sin his brothers wanted to hide forever. Now, the brothers are terrified. The highest authority in Egypt knows their crime, and with a single word, he could have them executed. But Joseph has no such intention. He says this to his anxious brothers in verse 5. Let's read verse 5 together. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Joseph reassures his anxious brothers, do not be distressed, do not be angry with yourselves. God sent me ahead of you to save lives. Joseph is declaring that his own pain, and even the sin of his brothers who sold him, all of it happened within God's providence to save lives. Because Joseph confronted his pain instead of ignoring it, he is now able to re-examine and reinterpret his suffering from the perspective of God's sovereign plan. That's right. For us to experience God's providence in our own lives, we must go through a necessary process. We must confront our pain and our wounds. We can only be healed when we face our inner pain. Only then can we truly see and declare God's good and sovereign plan. But if we don't, if we just cover up and bury our pain, it will eventually fester and burst, erupting somewhere else in our lives. Simply suppressing or avoiding these things is never the right solution. It only makes the wound deeper. We need the courage to confront our pain, our wounds, and the past we want to avoid. We need the courage to bring that pain before the cross and, like Joseph, weep aloud. It is there that God will restore us, heal us, and lead us by His amazing grace. If a patient goes to the hospital and hides their wound from the doctor, will they get better? Of course not. There could be nothing more foolish. To be healed, a patient must show the doctor their wounds, describing the pain as honestly and in as much detail as possible. Otherwise, the sickness will only get worse. They must honestly confess their pain and confront it to be treated and to recover. The treatment might be painful at first, but to recover, to be healed, we must be willing to bring our wounds into the light. Is there any unresolved pain or hidden wound within you that you are still not confronting? For now, it might seem easier to just bury it and move on, but that is a lie. We must confront it. Even if it is hard, we must bring it before the cross and weep aloud to experience the grace of healing and restoration that only God can give. As you pray this morning, ask God to bring to mind any pain or wounds you have buried deep within you. Ask Him for the courage to confront that pain before Him. Through that process, God will restore us as individuals, restore our families, and restore our church and our community. I urge you to pray with this faith this morning.